Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but also director of the centre. And today I have a very special guest. We're joined by Andrew Head, who lives in Australia. Andrew is a great friend of the centre. He's done several of our courses, and I've interviewed him before about audio versions. One of the many gifts that Andrew brings to us is that he's looking at this from the point of view of someone who is blind. So obviously audio versions of books are incredibly important to him. And I regard him as something as my guru, my expert on all things fantasy. So hello, Andrew.
Hello, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Over the last few months, there's been a big event in Tolkien's 50th year since he passed away, and that is the audio version of the Silmarillion has just come out, read by Andy Serkis. This follows on to his previous contributions to the Tolkien audiobooks, where he read The Hobbit, which I think started as a lockdown project, and then he went on to read the entirety of Lord of the Rings. Now he's turned his attention to the Silmarillion, and we're going to give our thoughts on that production. But first of all, before we do that, for people who haven't read the Silmarillion and think, oh, maybe rather than sit down and read it, I'll try it as an audio. Andrew, what are they going to get if they've come from Lord of the Rings and they turn to the Silmarillion? What are they going to get as a listening experience? What's in it, basically?
Well, the Silmarillion is basically a prequel, if you will, to The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and it details a vast scope of the history of Middle-earth, particularly focusing on the First Age and the Second Ages of Middle-earth. Of course, everything in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings takes place in the Third Age.
The other thing, of course, to mention is the Silmarillion is not, it's like a set of working papers that Tolkien had, and it was published posthumously, edited by his son. So we're getting something which has another person's hand upon it, which is Christopher Tolkien.
Yes.
It's broken down into a number of parts. So the first part of it, there's a couple of creation narratives. And then there's the big chunk which gives the title to the book, which is the story of these jewels, the Silmarils, which is the first age of Middle-earth or of the world. And then there's a second age, which for those of you who are following and watch the Rings of Power series, that's set in the second age. That is about, well, one of the main narratives is what happens to the land of Numenor, which is the land where Aragorn's ancestors come from, and also the making of the Rings of Power. And then the third age is the one, as Andrew just said, where you've got the story of the Lord of the Rings right at the end of that age. Okay, so we're looking at a long history book, basically. And what would you say you find in listening to the style of it?
It's certainly the way it's written. It's because as you say, a lot of tales and papers were cobbled together or brought together by Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's son. So it reads more like a history book rather than a novel. But you do get, it still has stories as history books do, but they're condensed. Some of the details are a bit condensed, and some of the details are go into a bit more depth. Some of the stories, I should say, go into a bit more depth. So it's a bit of an interesting mixed bag of styles here.
Yeah, I think perhaps it's a bit similar. If you're looking for an equivalent, dare I say, it's a bit like reading the Bible. You've got different kinds of styles in stories. Yeah. And the conceit is that it's written by the elves. So whereas the Lord of the Rings is written by Bilbo and Frodo and a little bit by Sam, that's the conceit there. So it's seen by the ordinary folk of the Shire. The Silmarillion is written by, let's imagine, some elvish historian sitting in a ivory elven tower somewhere. So it
Mm,
means that they are looking at things from a sort of great height. They're not down amongst the weeds and walking through the countryside in the way that
mm,
you get the lovely sort of physical details in Lord of the Rings of actually the experience of the landscape. Though there are exceptions to that. There are some tales where you do actually feel the presence of the landscape much more acutely. So
mm,
as you were saying, Andrew, some of the details are there, but it's not an adventure story in the same way. It's like sitting down, a bit like sitting down to say, read the Bible. And if you're a
mm,
Tolkien fan, you probably will feel inspired to do that. But if you're not a Tolkien fan, you'll probably think, my goodness, this is strange. This is a strange
mm.
experience. Okay, so
Yeah.
we've actually done podcasts on the Silmarillion. So if you want to sort of go into more detail about this, do dip back into our earlier episodes. Anyway, Andrew, let's get down to the nitty gritty of why we are talking today. And that is, what's your feeling? Because I know that you and I have both listened to the Andy Serkis reading of it. Give me your top 3 takeaways from the experience of listening to it.
Well, I think the Andy Serkis's reading itself, the voices that he does, especially, he certainly got away with the voices. Glaurung in particular, I was quite shocked by.
But is
um,
Glaurung the dragon?
the yes, yes, the large dragon that terrorizes Nargothrond and Turin. Yeah, his voice was quite definitely made you think of a large lizard-like creature, very hissing but also deep and very menacing. Pulled that off very well. Certainly the way the tone that he Andy Serkis reads this particular book in really lends itself to the high elvish or the high writing style that it's set in. He certainly paints the picture of it being a large sweeping history, shall we say? And one very important thing I got from reading it, especially in a from an shall I say an accessibility point of view. um, it starts off with Andy Serkis reading the preface that Christopher Tolkien wrote and the forward, and then it goes on to do part of a letter that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote to a friend explaining the plot outline of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. Because for those that don't know, Tolkien wanted to publish the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings as one large book called the Saga of the Jewels and the Rings. But the publisher, realized that the Lord of the Rings itself was going to be a large enough task. So he persuaded Tolkien to focus on the Lord of the Rings first and do the Silmarillion later.
Yeah,
So it
that's a
was,
really good point. Just as in the Andy Serkis version of The Lord of the Rings, he reads some of the appendices, which you don't tend to get
mm,
other versions. I also
yeah,
really valued that. I've got a first edition of the Silmarillion, so I don't have in my edition those other 2 pieces, which must have been now regularly
ah,
um, within the actual Silmarillion books you buy. The second, I've got the one with the first
mm,
forward. There's been a later forward plus this letter, and I agree with you that that letter is very helpful indeed. It's like a crib. you know
yeah,
what's it, cliff notes to the Silmarillion, and I really enjoyed listening to that as well. My top
mm,
3, that was one of them. The other is I really thought he did a good job on the pronunciation.
oh yes,
Yeah,
mm,
because that's the thing which I presumably he's had experts next to him, but there seemed to be maybe there's some super experts out there who will say, oh no, he got the intonation wrong or the emphasis wrong, but actually I felt he managed this quite arcane language really well. And then the other
yeah.
thing
It's certainly in Old English, isn't it? Or more Old English style.
well, yeah, he's
Lots
like
of that.
the Venerable Bede kind of style, isn't it?
Yeah.
Chronicles.
Mm,
And then the other thing, which I think picks up on your point about the voice for the dragon, is that when there were chances to dramatize it, he really went for it. And it could showed you how it could be in a way that there's this dramatic story that just needs a bit more writing to make it turn it from this chronicle to a novel. And I really enjoyed that, like you, when he was doing the talking dog Huon and others, there was little moments where I really enjoyed it. And I find him very easy to listen to. I'm a bit brainwashed in the same way as when my kids were growing up. I got very used to listening to Stephen Fry chuntering away on the Harry Potter sort of saga that they all listened to at different stages. It sort of went into the bones after a while. I got the feeling that listening to Andy Serkis read The Hobbit, then The Lord of the Rings, and then The Silmarillion is going to have the same effect. I'm going to start hearing him in my head whenever I read the book, which isn't, it's not a bad voice to have. So I think he did an excellent job of the actual performance, the actual reading of it. So, Andrew, but when we've talked about these versions before, you and I have both agreed that we really liked the earlier version, which I think was only from maybe 2015. It's not that old. The Martin Shaw version, reading of the Silmarillion. Do you have any words to say on that? I mean, if someone's already got the Martin Shaw version, do they need to go out and get this one? What would they be missing out if they didn't get this one?
Well, they're certainly missing out on the extra information you get in the foreword and the preface and the Tolkien letter, because Martin Shaw version doesn't have it. So if you're, especially from a blind person's point of view, I did not expect those three little beginning parts. So I was quite chuffed and it's always interesting to read more on Christopher Tolkien's point of view and J.R.R. Tolkien's point of view. And Christopher Tolkien in particular provides good insight into how and why he wanted to publish the Silmarillion after his father passed away.
I think that the Martin Shaw is very, his voice is lovely. It's a very another voice, not that dissimilar to Andy Serkis. It's resonant. It's got a sense of gravity about it. I would say that he has a couple of little mannerisms which Andy Serkis has avoided. Tolkien rather overuses the word therefore. And when it comes up in the text, and Martin Shaw lands rather heavily on that. Therefore. And once I noticed that, I got a little bit, okay. And Andy Serkis doesn't do that. I was listening out for it. So I think that possibly the Andy Serkis narration has that edge just as a narratorial voice. He gives it more variety. He pushes the drama a bit further. I wouldn't have thought there was a huge amount of difference between the narrations in the chapters where there are less dramatic episodes, where it's more an account of the ages. They're just two different voices. But I would say if you're going to sort of do a toss-up between the two, I would now go, if I was starting afresh, I'd now go for the Andy Serkis one.
Yes, I think I would too. But it's always a bit of I guess it depends on your mood, because I do still quite like Martin Shaw's version. He has a great voice as well, as you say. So yeah, next time reading round, I'm unsure which one I will do.
Well, there's nothing stopping us. There's nothing stopping us shuffling between the two.
It's very true.
For a bit of variety, have one voice read one chapter and one voice read another. I can see an advantage to doing that.
Oh, that's a good idea. The other thing I like about the Martin Shaw version is you get music in that one, sort of at the end of each of the main sub stories.
Oh yes, you're right. Although I love yes, you're right. There's great music. It's like a sort of it picks up the feeling of the incoming tide, and it's got a really atmosphere. Yes, you're right. They should have done that with the Andy Serkis one.
Yeah.
I think it's the same publisher, so they missed a trick there.
Oh,
lovely punctuation marks.
Yeah, it really adds a bit to the atmosphere and epicness of the tale.
Yeah,
they don't seem to do music as much in audiobooks these days.
Well, didn't they also? This is us being quite, not many people will have noticed this, but I think the old
Mm.
Lord of the Rings reading by I've forgotten his name, Robert Ingalls,
Rob,
also has
yeah,
music in at the end of each book.
it does. Yes,
Yeah, bring back the
yes,
music.
yeah.
So let's talk about our favorite parts. We can put aside, the two narrators. Well done both for
Mm.
sitting there and reading quite a difficult book.
Mm.
What is your favorite part of the Silmarillion? If you were just going to dip back in and listen to one or two chapters, what would you go for?
Oh,
Now, I've stumped you there, haven't I?
yes, that's a difficult one. Well, you said a couple, so it would have to be Beren and Luthien, and then it would have to be the Calabeth or the downfall of Numenor.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. So Beren and Luthien are
Mm.
like the precursor to Aragorn and Arwen. They are a man and an elf who fall in love. And
Yeah.
Tolkien identified very much with Beren and Luthien. In fact, on his gravestone, he and his wife are known as Beren and Luthien. So it was his heart story. And I completely agree. I think it's two chapters. One of in the
Mm.
Andy Serkis, it's extremely well read as well. And it has the talking dog.
Mm.
So what's not to like? There's the folkloric
Yeah.
structure of the hero being set an impossible task. He has to go and get one of the Silmarils from the hand of Melkor, who's like the biggest baddie of them all. It's very much like one of those fairy tales. He sets off, and Luthien, who is actually really the hero of the tale, let's face it, she goes with him.
Mm.
Hooray! One of the what's the word? Are we allowed to say kick-ass heroines of Tolkien? Doesn't feel very Tolkien
Yeah.
word. Feisty, maybe that's a bit more Tolkien. Um, I'm not sure I'd go for the Numenor section, but I would go,
Mm.
though it is fascinating. I actually like the poetry of the language of the very beginning, which is the Eine, I can never say this, Eine
I know
Linde.
Lindelay.
Yeah, that is the
Mm.
setting up of the world. I love the image of the music and how it's described. This does feel very biblical, or actually Miltonic
Mm.
in the way it's described. And I just think it is the language is so beautiful. I wouldn't mind if it was Martin Shaw or Andy Serkis, both of them read it very well. So perhaps on my
Mm.
either or, I'll do Martin Shaw for that, and then I'll do Beren and Luthien with Andy Serkis, and then everybody's happy. So
Yeah.
that's my pick. And
Mm.
then my last question to you is, which of these stories would you most like to have seen written up into a full-length book? You told me before we started this call that you've actually read some of the later curated longer length versions of these stories and you have views on them. I'd like to share us those views and then tell us what you would like to have seen written up in the same way as a sort of Lord of the Rings style book.
Yes. Well, you've got The Children of Hurin, which is a full-length standalone novel. It's had, parts from the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales that aren't quite exactly the same, brought together, and then a bit from the history of Middle Earth, I believe, as well. Turned it into a full-length 7-hour book, but the audio book is 7 hours. And for those that don't know, that is read by the wonderful Christopher Lee, who played Saruman in the movies. So that's well worth a listen, that one. And then you have Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin. They're the other two longer tales. And there's bits from the Silmarillion and other papers that have all other writings that have been brought together. But they're actually interspersed with, so you get story, but then interspersed with Christopher Tolkien's notes and sort of showing you how the story's changed over time. So you get characters with different names and different happenings in the events in the story, and then Christopher Tolkien's writings come in and explains how it's changed over the many, many years. And then you get the next part that's, how do I put it, similar, sort of shows this story evolving over time.
So
Uh,
what, the successive drafts of the story?
yes,
Mm.
that's it. Thank you. Yes, and he sort of all brought them together. And you still, don't get me wrong, you still get the story. And as I say, it's interesting to hear that, but it does, if you're expecting a story, it does at times make it a little bit tedious and a bit difficult to get through. Even for me, who enjoys hearing more about the process as an author, it can be a bit challenging to get through.
Yes, because what you're
Um,
really listening to is a story of how a story is written, isn't it? Rather than the actual
yeah.
story. A kind of it's
Mm.
very meta.
Yeah, and the nice thing, the way with the audio versions of those books is they have a father and son, Timothy and Samuel West, and Timothy reads the Christopher Tolkien part, and then his son Samuel reads the actual story that J.R.R. Tolkien's written. So it helps if you're listening to it, it helps break it up a bit and helps you focus better because you've got two different voices and you're like, okay, this voice does this part. So I think if you're listening to it, you have an advantage over if you were just reading it. It might be even harder to understand at some points.
That's a very good point. They also do an excellent job on
Mm.
the Unfinished Tales, where they do a similar
Yes.
thing.
Yeah,
Um,
they do.
yeah. So another,
um,
all the audio versions I've come across, all are pretty good, actually. I've not come
mm,
across a dud version. I think they offer different pleasures.
mm.
So
So to,
oh, you haven't answered yet the question about which one you'd like to
yeah,
see treated as a sort of Lord of the Rings style book, a proper
yes.
narrative from the point of view of some characters having an adventure.
And I gave that spiel so that people would understand why I'm about to say what I'm about to say. So I would, even though in a sense, Beren and Luthien is a standalone novel now. It is, but it can't, with the breaking up of Christopher Tolkien's explanations throughout the story, as opposed to in a prologue or an epilogue or a foreword or whatever you want to call it. It makes it a bit tricky, and I was expecting that it would have been the same. Both would have been both Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin would have been the same as the Children of Hurin, where it is a standalone novel from cover to cover.
Mm.
Uh, so I was really hoping and would have liked Beren and Luthien to be a standalone 7 hour book. Once the story started, it continues on, and I don't know, maybe there just wasn't, for whatever reason, as much detail as there was with the Children of Huron, which is why there was a lot of explanation and examples of the different drafts put in. But still, it would have been nice.
Right, I'm going to give a different answer. So
Mm,
that which is good.
mm,
I think, having sort of pondered this for a while now, that actually where I would go as a storyteller is I would tell the story of Elrond and Elros and their parents, Erendil and
mm.
Elwing, which it comes at the end of the First Age. Why? Because there's a hostage
Yes.
story of two children taken hostage by the two
Mm,
remaining sons of Fëanor, who are holding them hostage, and there's a fight over a jewels, and I won't spoil it because it's got such a dramatic end
mm,
where, well, it's been out now for quite a few years, so I'm not really spoiling an end.
mm,
But I think the actual story arc of what happens to the sort of, they're not exactly bad guys because they're conflicted. They're not like Melkor, who's just evil.
mm,
They're interesting shades of grey bad guys, which make them more interesting. And
mm,
Elros and Elrond are the young innocents. They're the like Hobbit style perspective, which you need in the story to make it relatable. So I think meeting, and they then have the choice themselves between immortality or mortal life. I think that whole thing, Tolkien estate, needs a good novel.
mm,
Happy to do it, but find someone else if not. I think that would make a really,
mm,
really good novel or a good series
mm.
if
And
people are looking for future places to go because it's so engaging.
yes, and I'm very glad you mentioned that because I'm actually, if that was to ever happen, I'd actually be quite excited about that because yeah, you've got that, and then you've got all the Elros going to Numenor and setting all that, starting all that, and get a more in-depth young years of Numenor when it was newly established island. And then, of course, and this would have been really interesting when, of course, because Elros has chosen the path of men and he's mortal, so he eventually passes away. And I just think, to explore that and how Elrond, copes that his brother's gone, that would have just been wow.
Yeah, I think that makes yeah, in terms of a novel, you'd probably finish it there, wouldn't you? You could finish it there. That's like a epilogue with the brother dying and some sense of what's to come. Anyway, I've already written this in my head. I know they control everything so fiercely that this is just on my wish list. But that's what I would have asked Tolkien to do if he was still with us, or somebody if they let somebody else have a go at it. If they do release the rights at all for the first age, that would be where I would go as the storyteller, because it brings in the history of the Silmarils, but right at the end of it all, when the fate of the Silmarils is actually settled. Anyway, I doubt anyone's listening from the Tolkien estate, but that's what I think has story potential. Andrew, thank you so much for talking this through. We always like to end with where in all the fantasy world is the best place for something. And on this theme of narrators and stories, I wonder if you've got an idea of where is the best place to go and listen to a story. Have you ever sort of thought, oh, I'd really love to be in such and such a location and listen to a story told by one of the storytellers of legend? While you're thinking about that, I'll give my answer. I think I would like to go, and there's a very sweet book called The King of the Copper Mountain. It's a Dutch storybook, and it's about an old king who's dying, and every so often there's a knock on the door, and in order to keep him alive, the doctor who's treating him has sent different animals to tell him a tale to keep him happy whilst he looks for the medicine to cure him. But the ones that come are so surprising. There's the more predictable fox and what have you. And then there's a swarm of bees. They come tell the story. And then there's a dragon, bit out of left field. I think that'd be really interesting to be with the King of the Copper Mountain, waiting to see what animal is going to come through next. Have you got a favorite place for storytelling?
I'll give two. So my last answer was it'd be great to be in Rivendell with the elves and listen to the epic tales told by Elrond or one of the other elves over a feast. But I also think another good place would be Cair Paravel in Narnia. And I'd certainly like to ask what we don't get when reading the Chronicles of Narnia. Well, we sort of do with The Horse and His Boy, but I'd like to ask Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy for more stories of what they did during their reign in Narnia. Because
what did you actually do?
Because we hear so much especially in A Horse and His Boy, so much is alluded to, but we really don't see too much of that.
Well, that's a lovely thought. I think I'd also like to ask some of the talking animals to tell their tales from their point of view. That'd be fun.
Oh, of course. Yes, of course.
Yeah. Great place. Thank you so much, Andrew, for talking through the Andy Serkis reading of the Silmarillion. I think we're both for giving it a thumbs up, aren't we? Which is nice.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for having me again.